Hi, my name's Dan. I'm going to talk to you about passage planning. Passage planning, very simply, is getting from A to B in a safe manner, and that's what we're going to have a little look at, just the very basics of it and what we might need to think about if we're going to take either a yacht or a dinghy or any other floating equipment really from A to B and get ourselves there in a useful, safe manner at the other end to be able to enjoy ourselves. So previously on a couple of other how-to videos, we've had Emily's been showing us how to use a couple of bits of equipment. So that will be the charts, which we'll refer back to a couple of times during this little video. Dividers as well on how to measure the distance on the side. So taking a distance from A to B, taking to the side and then working out how far that might be. And also another piece of equipment, which is a plotter, which might actually allow us to, or will actually allow us to work out what course we might want to steer if we're going to use a compass course to steer along. I'm not going to go into massive detail, but I'm just pointing out the kit that we might have there to use. So as I've said, passage plan is about getting from A to B, which may be something as short and as simple as, for example, in the Solent, where if you've been sailing with the Trust previously, you'll be going from somewhere nice and easy, somewhere like Cowes just up here, down to Yarmouth down in this sort of direction. So, and if we were to measure that off the side with our dividers, we'd find that that would be somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 miles roughly on the side there. So effectively what we can work out from that when we actually dial it down is we can work our boat speed out, because we may have sailed a boat before, or the skipper might know roughly how quickly the boat will sail and therefore how long it's going to take to get down to Yarmouth. Now I know from previous experience, if I sail directly from Cowes to Yarmouth, I could do it in about 2 hours in realistic terms, and sometimes quicker on certain boats. However, with the Trust, what we like to do is take things a little bit more leisurely, have a bit of fish off the back, maybe some food on the way down, there's a stop for lunch somewhere. So all of that comes into passage planning. So how do we want to get from A to B, not only safely but also enjoyably as well? So we might plan that into our passage at the same time. So going in that sort of direction, or somewhere else within the Solent or up at Largs or wherever you might be sailing, we need to take a couple of other things into account as well. So those would be things like food and clothing. So if we know we're going to take a passage from Cowes to Yarmouth and it's going to take us 2 to 3 hours, we'll need to make sure we have enough drink, okay, enough water, which most of the yachts have in taps on board, but you may be sailing something slightly less exclusive and with less kit on board it. So you might need to take bottled water or something else to drink with you, really important. Things like sun cream, clothing, and also food as well to keep us nice and full. Now we also like food on the Trust trip as well, so most of the guys that have been sailing with us previously will be very appreciative of the fact we do eat quite well on the Trust trip. So just bear that in mind, that food is a very important commodity to have on a boat, and no one likes a hungry, grumpy crew, so that's really important to remember. Those are the basics of it. So we might be looking at waterproofs from a clothing point of view, or we might be looking at shorts and t-shirt, and therefore the sunscreen as well, which is really important. And I think from that side of it, if you get the basics for your crew comfort or your own comfort sorted out, you're well on the way to getting your passage plan sorted out. We might also think about ways of communicating. So there might be radio on board the boat, or there might be a mobile phone that you might take with you. So those are very important, and we might also tell someone where we might be planning to head to, and roughly how long it's going to take us to get there, so they can be keeping an eye out for us or expect a phone call at the other end. The slightly more detailed part of our passage plan involves the speed we're going to try and get there, but also the tide and the wind as well. So the tide and the wind are very important. You may have seen the videos by Mark Turner. He was looking at the very basics of tide and also the weather and what clouds look like when we're looking at those. So if we were to actually pull a weather forecast off the internet, it might look something like this. This is an inshore forecast weather forecast for Celtigal to Lyme Regis, which would actually cover the Cowes Solent area, so that covers us very nicely. This particular weather forecast is actually quite a strong wind one, so we've actually got the wind is in a westerly 5 to 7, decreasing 3 to 4. Now those figures might not mean much to you, but if we were to take that from the forecast and place it on what we call the Beaufort scale, handily placed in this book here, which is actually the powerboating handbook, this actually breaks down what a force might actually mean in real terms. So it mentioned a force 6 in there somewhere, so that's actually gives us 21 knots of wind. It's described as a strong breeze. The wave height could be up to 2.5 metres high plus. Therefore they're large waves, and in this particular instance it says do something else because it's a powerboating handbook. There was also a force 7 in that particular forecast as well, which doesn't feature in this particular book, which tells us that powerboaters in smaller powerboats won't go or shouldn't really go afloat in anything above a sort of force 4 to 5. And that may apply to us as well, because actually anything above a force 4 to 5 in our particular scenario might not be that comfortable for us to sail in. So we may find that spending that much time on the top of the boat on the deck isn't actually that much fun to do. In that particular instance, we might either go in a different direction for somewhere for more shelter, or just stay where we actually started from, spend another day there, and then move on to somewhere else afterwards. So the wind forecast is really important to look at. The other things on here are things like sea state. So we've looked at the Beaufort scale, so we can roughly gauge what the sea state might be, but the Met Office like to give us a bit more information. So they will also tell us that the sea state is slight to moderate, occasionally rough at first, so that tells us it might drop down later in the day. The weather, thundery showers, also a bit of a risk there with lightning and thunder, and the visibility good, occasionally poor. All of those are abbreviated in different sort of books, but the almanac has those physical words broken down into them, and that's a document that you will have on most boats. It's a big thick book which gives us lots of information, but some of it's a breakdown of the actual tide tables. You can also get other publications, things like the Day Skipper book, the Advanced Sailing book, the Weather book by Chris Tibbs. Loads of these different books will give us lots of information about how to break down this type of weather forecast and give you the best information that you can possibly get for going sailing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you take this and go and find every publication you can to go and work out what's the best sailing you can go and do. I'd take advice off of other people that are more experienced than you in that particular instance, and just make a judgment call. One of the best forecasts you can actually get is actually getting out of your cabin, going upstairs and actually having a look at what's going on around you as well, and that will tell you a really good amount of information about what the weather's actually doing, how it feels as well. So by all means take a weather forecast on board, have a look at what it might mean, but also work out actually outside, is that reality or is it something different? So weather's one thing, the other thing's tides. So tides are really important to look at for many different reasons, because they can either speed up how quickly we get from our location. So for example, within the Solent, if I just hold this up here, when the tide comes in, it comes in up past the Needles and then down and around, and also flows around the back of the island as well. So if you enlarge this to the UK map, Great Britain, you'll find that the tide follows along the bottom of the south coast and also up the west coast, around the east coast. Then when it turns around and goes the other way, it will flow back in a smaller scale, back around the Isle of Wight and back in the other direction. So if we were trying to find out whether we were going to get from A to B in this particular instance in a certain way, we would actually try and go with the tide if we could, which would speed up our progress down towards our destination. Alternatively, if we knew we had to get there, and that's exactly where we wanted to go, we might say that we'll set off a little bit earlier and spend a little bit more time getting there, and maybe stop off in one or two other locations on the way for lunch, etc., to actually make our passage a bit more of a day to get down there. So there's a few things to think about. So the tide on the way back out flows around back the other side of the Isle of Wight and then back off down the other side of the south coast as well. So that's the movement of the tides around, in and out, depending obviously what our tidal prediction points out. So as Mark Turner pointed out in one of the videos that he did, he was talking about the fact that tide's very predictable, and therefore we can work out very far in advance what it's going to look like. If you were to look in the almanac that I mentioned earlier, you would also find a tide table. Now this is a zoomed in version, and it's actually a Portsmouth tide table. And what it's actually telling us at this particular point, I've actually highlighted the day that I'm recording this, and on this particular day, on the 27th of August, it gives us some numbers on both sides. So that's the date, and then these are times on this side here, and then we've also got the amount of tide that we're expecting in that particular period of time. When we look at these particular numbers, so if we take the time for example, the time is a really important one to look at. So hopefully you've all heard of British Summer Time, or BST, and what that effectively means is when the clocks go forwards or backwards, obviously depending which way around you're going, when we're in British Summer Time we've actually got to add an hour onto these particular tide times on the bit of paper in the almanac. So for example at 4:31 on here is low water, and I'll explain the low water again in a second. But actually we've got to add an hour, so in reality this time on the 27th of August, this morning at 5:31 was actually low water, so we have to add an hour. And then high water, 11:24 on here, so 12:24 in reality. And the reason I know it's high water and low water is because of this number on the other side. So at low water it's 0.8, which is pretty low as far as figures go. And then 4.9 is the high water figure. So I can tell just by looking at that the lower figure is going to be low water and the higher figure is going to be the high water. You may find on another day in another sort of in the same month that actual distance and speed and amount of tide that's coming in will differ slightly. So actually it'll be a lesser amount between high water and low water, and that just depends on where the moon is in relation to the Earth. And what phase it's in at the moment. So at this particular time here, we're actually in what we call spring tides. Now I'm not going to go into massive detail around tidal sort of information purely because it's about passage planning. So if we look at the almanac and work out what the tide's actually going to be doing for this particular day, we know that at 11:24 or 12:24 in reality, as we just said, it's going to be high water. So all morning the tide is going to be coming in. So if we're actually going sailing in that direction, in reality we'd have the wind with us in this particular forecast and the tide with us. However, there's some really good places to eat up there, really nice places to have a barbecue, good spots to play rounders. So actually we're really desperate to get up that way. So what we might do instead is bring ourselves up against the tide, okay, or just wait a little bit later and stop off for lunch in one of these other ports. Now what's really important to realise as well, that when we're sailing from sailing from our start location to our end location, is that these other ports might also be what we call a safe haven, so somewhere to hide if that weather forecast comes in as strong as it said and we think it's a little bit too much for us now. So we could head across the river to Bewley, across the Solent over to this direction and hide up here for lunch. Really nice at the top there, nice and picturesque and very quiet. Or we could even come sort of up to Newtown Creek if the high water was at the right sort of time, which we know around lunchtime it would be. So there's a couple of safe haven options there as well. We could also go up towards Southampton Water and hide at the top there for a little bit and then make our way down later in the day. So there are a few things to think about from a wind and tide sort of point of view. With our particular forecast that we had the wind coming from the west and the tide actually going if we head off in the morning, and they might be against each other. So it's also important to work out whether the wind and tide are going to be fighting each other, and if they do, you tend to find the sea state is a lot higher than it might be otherwise. So again, that's another thought process to have. So you may find that actually on a strong wind day, you might wait for the tide to actually be behind you and the wind to be behind you, or go in a slightly different direction to make it a nice smooth sea state, as opposed to having to fight it all the way there. So a few things to think about from that point of view. So just to wrap it up, passage planning is very much about getting from A to B safely, as I said at the beginning, and also choosing the right passage to go and do. So you may find that even though you want to go from Cowes to Yarmouth, that we've been talking about quite a lot, it may not be the right day to do that. So you might find that you're reassessing your scenario and actually saying, well, actually what we'll do today is something a little bit different, and then we'll try that passage again tomorrow. Or alternatively, we'll just sail off in a different direction and go and do something different for our next couple of sailing days. So just to wrap passage planning up, it's about and reiterating about the fact that we're trying to get from A to B in a safe manner, and that might mean changing the plan and doing A to B in a safe manner on a later date if that's the case. Making sure that you look at all the equipment that you might need, whether it's from the clothing to food to liquid to just safety equipment you might take, so whether it's a mobile phone or radio, those sort of things. Finding some publications that give you some really good information. So I mentioned the Advanced Handbook earlier. This actually has a really good, it's actually a dinghy sailing handbook, but it has a really good section a section on day sailing and passage planning within that book there. So that's good for anybody really, whether you're a yacht master or a dinghy sailor. That's something to bear in mind. Also the Day Skipper book as well, which takes you through in massive detail around everything to do with sailing a small yacht, which is what the Trust do, and what most of the trips the Trust actually takes young people on. That does the whole lot in there as well. Again, very detailed. And you can also find things like the Powerboat Handbook if you've actually got no access to the other particular books. So there's a few things to actually bear in mind. And then from a point of view of other equipment, it may be appropriate if you've got a big enough boat with a dry area to have something like a chart on board. And as I said, the equipment, whether it's the dividers and the plotter or some other equipment that does the same job, to allow you to measure distance and also plot a course. So actually physically having the plotter on board and then pass it with one hand, and then actually working out what course you might steer under a compass. The other alternative to that is what we do a lot in the Solent and up in Largs as well, is actually what we call pilotage, and that's spotting different items along the way, whether they're buoys or landmarks that you might hop from one to the other on, to actually get a good indication of where you're going on your passage plan. So hopefully that's given you a good indication of what you might be looking at with a passage plan. There's lots more detail in there, whether it's the actual planning of the actual courses themselves, looking at the weather forecast. There's so much detail to go into, but from a point of view of the basics, hopefully that's covered it, and look forward to seeing you next time we go sailing.